Are you going to come in? Hello, I'm Madeline Hutchins. I'm one of the organisers of the Ellen Hutchins Festival and a researcher on Ellen, and I am her great-great-grandniece. Welcome to this webinar, Ellen Hutchins and Inspiration, and this is part of the Ellen Hutchins Virtual Festival of 2020. We're delighted you can join us from wherever you are. We're very pleased to have Finola Finlay of the Roaringwater Journal in the chair for this session. But just before I hand over to her, a few words about the format of this evening. I expect some of you are experienced Zoom users and others probably less so. This is a webinar, not a meeting, which gives slight differences. We control your screen view as participants, and we will show either the one person, the presenter view as you've got now, or the gallery view of myself, with the technician next to me, Sean, who's out of view at the moment, and the three speakers for this evening. You as participants are all muted and invisible to each other and to us. You can submit questions, which we'll take after the speakers have done the first session. And you can submit the questions via the Q&A function. The chat is turned off. We expect the session to finish by 9 p.m. or a little bit earlier. And just one last bit on this, a tip from more experienced Zoom users than myself. If you're experiencing difficulties with your connection, a simple way that often solves it is to leave the meeting and join again. Now I will hand you over to Finola.
Thank you very much, Madeline, and it's my great pleasure to greet everybody, and thanks so much for participating in this way in this Zoom webinar. My name is Finola Finlay. Together with my husband, Robert Harris, I write the West Cork blog, Roaringwater Journal, and I run a Facebook page, Wildflowers of West Cork. I've been following Ellen's story and participating in the festival since it began, and I'm delighted to be part of tonight's discussion with Marianne Lee and Laura McKenna. Marianne grew up in Tullamore, County Offaly, but she now lives in Dublin. She has a first-class honours degree in visual communications from the National College of Art and Design and an MPhil in creative writing from Trinity College. Most of Marianne's working life to date has been spent as a designer and a copywriter. I think those are both excellent apprenticeships for her now new career as a novelist. Her first novel, A Quiet Tide, which is an imagining of the life of and work of Ellen Hutchins, has just been published by New Island Press and is available at all good bookshops. It's been very positively received and has garnered several excellent reviews. Like Marianne, Laura McKenna spent most of her working life to date in a completely different field. She was a child psychiatrist. Once she decided to turn to literature, she set herself to the task seriously and has completed an MA from UCD and a doctorate from UCC, both in creative writing. Her poetry's been nominated for the Hennessy Literary Award, and her first novel, Words to Shape My Name, will be coming out next year. Both Marianne and Laura were chosen to participate in the Irish Writers' Centre Novel Fair, although in different years. So despite the many commonalities they share, this is their first time at the same event. So warmest welcomes to both of you.
Very nice to be here.
Now, we're going to start with a reading from Marianne. And Marianne, I wonder if you would like to tell us about what reading you've chosen to do tonight and why. Set the scene for us a little bit, okay?
In this chapter, James Townsend Mackay, who is curator of the Botanic Gardens of Trinity College Dublin at the time, and he was a good friend of Ellen's friend and, you know, somewhat surrogate father, Whitley Stokes, and she had lived with Whitley Stokes in Dublin for a time, and that's where she met Mackay. In this section, Mackay has come down to West Cork on one of his botany trips, collecting plants, investigating rare plants, and he's just arrived at Ballylickey, which is Ellen's family home. And, you know, I'll start. This is an important juncture of Ellen's career as a botanist. Up to this point, she's been in West Cork for a little time. She has been struggling a little bit to find her way. She is interested in botany. She's been out on walks. She has started the process of becoming a botanist, but she's wondering really what direction to take. And at this point, Mackay comes and points her in a very important direction, which shapes her future career. Having sent word some weeks previously, James Townsend Mackay arrived on a damp July morning after breakfast. As he came into the parlour, his trim form dusted with drizzle, she jumped to her feet. "You see, I have not forgotten you, Miss Hutchins," he said. Kate hovered near the door. The last stranger to call had been a notary from Cork to see Jack in February. "May I introduce you to my mother?" Ellen said. "Mother, Mr. Mackay has recently been appointed curator of the Botanic Gardens of Trinity College, Dublin." "Delighted, Mr. Mackay," Leonora said. "Will you take tea?" "I won't at present, thank you, Mrs. Hutchins." Mackay peered through the window. "I see the mist is lifting. My limbs are stiff from the ride. Perhaps your daughter could accompany me for some air. Miss Hutchins, have you time to spare?" She did. While walking, he gave her news of friends. He had gone herborising, as he called it, with Dr. Stokes the previous month in the woods at Luttrellstown. Later, at Harcourt Street, William had been brought down from the nursery to be shown off. He was, according to Mr. Mackay, a startlingly alert child who at 9 months could almost walk and already spoke some words. "And of course, I see your cousin regularly." "How is Mr. Taylor?" "Very well. A trifle fatigued mentally following the long academic year, but in excellent spirits." He paused. "It occurs to me that you are rather alike," he said. "Mr. Taylor and I," she said. "Surely not." "Not in looks, I grant you," he said. "Yet there's something." His oars trilled and rolled like music. "Perfectly natural. You are cousins, I'm told." "Removed." "Indeed," he said. "Ah, the rocks. There's a shingle beach below." The sun broke through briefly and slipped away again behind a cloud. The Irish summer, a perpetual measuring of light against dark, as if neither should dominate. They climbed down to the beach. With his cane, Mr. Mackay lifted the edge of a mass of brown seaweed. "Bladder wrack," he said, "common on the Atlantic coast. How goes your botanizing? Mr. Stokes tells me you've made a start." "I have no one to ask for help or instruction. I long for a like-minded enthusiast to talk with. Alas, the only such friends I have are hundreds of miles away." "Your family support your endeavours?" "My mother knows how important it is for me to occupy my mind with some useful pursuit." "Fortunately, you have unique access to this treasure trove." Waving an arm to embrace the bay, the mountains. Then he prodded again at the thick seaweed. "Have you considered making algae your speciality?" Ellen bent and plucked a strand. "Is it so interesting?" Its flaccid, finger-like form made it appear scarcely a plant at all. "Firstly, algae are vastly unexplored. You'll find little in withering but the briefest introduction. Secondly, do you not think the form of the plant itself, hidden as it often is underwater, along with the strange fructification, makes for a fascinating subject?" She turned the strand over in her hand. "I can hardly tell the root, stem, and leaf apart. We distinguish the genera by the situation of what we presume are the flowers or seeds, or by comparison with similarly formed plants we're more familiar with." He pointed to the bulging pods, like green pearls within the clump. "These bladders carry the seeds, male and female. Let us take a sample now and study it later." "Will you stay with us long?" "A few days, if I may. I'm interested in the climate here, how it impacts on the plant life." "We scarcely ever get frost." A singular corner of the world. He turned from the sea and faced her, a swift motion that made his coattails whip against his legs. As different from the hurly-burly of Dublin as could possibly be. I am getting used to silence, she said carefully. My mother's house has few visitors. She wished he would not look at her with so kindly an expression. Sympathy was ever likely to make her falter. Do you often see acquaintances your own age? Apart from my brother, not at all. I see. He cleared his throat. You know, Miss Hutchins, I have often found in my own life that what initially seemed an unpalatable situation revealed itself in the fullness of time as an opportunity. When I came to Dublin as a friendless young man, I thought I had made a mistake. I sat alone in my accommodation by the quays, staring out the window at the chaotic scenes below, wondering if I should leap aboard the first available boat and return to Scotland. His eyes darkened, flicked out to sea. Then he smiled. But in time I adjusted, with the help of my benefactor, Dr. Scott. Once I travelled to the west of Ireland and began my studies in earnest, better fortune presented itself. I'm sure what you say is true, sir. I hope you don't mind my inquiring as to your frame of mind. You may do so unreservedly. I shall report back to Dr. Stokes that you appear content, at least. He held out his palm, squinted into the sky. Shall we make our way back? I shouldn't like for you to get a chill. The drizzle causes no great harm. Spoken like a born naturalist.
That was wonderful, Marianne, and really, as you say, set that scene of the pivotal point in her life. Before we go back to that, I'd like to ask Laura for a poem. Laura, can you read us one of your poems and tell us why you're choosing that particular one and what brought the poem to you in the way you chose to write it?
Okay, thank you. This poem it's inspired by Ellen in lots of ways about her botanizing, and in some respects I'm a very, very amateur. I'm a lover of wildflowers and I love looking for them. In fact, I can't not look for them when I'm out walking. So this particular poem was inspired by a time I was going looking for a particular plant that's found in the bog. It's a pale butterwort, which I have difficulty saying, butterwort. And it's a very small little flower. It's often hidden in the bog itself, under lots of the grass, and you actually have to kind of search for it. So I thought this might be an appropriate one to read. So it's to see pale butterwort in September bog. You must first get down on your knees and feel the seep of water through vitreous moss. Listen to moistness under shoe through splay of fingers. Part the grass with care as a child's soft hair. And there, tender-winged, the palely nodding head, barely held, a stalk so ready crushed. You look back at your path to this discovery and know the cost.
Laura, are you sure you weren't looking over my shoulder about 2 weeks ago when I had such a similar experience?
I know.
I love that line about parting the grass with care as a child's soft hair and getting right down close to that plant, because you have to, you can't see it otherwise, right?
No, it's well hidden.
All right, so let's bring on all three of us now. And I have a question for both of you. And really it arises out of the readings that both of you have just done. Because as you both know, Ellen was not a dilettante. Laura, as you've described yourself, a wildflower lover, she was not delighted by wildflowers, but I would say she was a true scientist, working methodically and carefully to record and illustrate all the species she came across. And this is particularly impressive because I think it's easy to love the color and beauty of wildflowers. But Ellen makes her contribution in the much more difficult field of seaweeds and lichens and mosses and liverworts. And I always think of those as plants with a face that only a mother could love. First of all, and especially for those who don't know much about her life, Marianne, let's start with you. Tell us some of the difficulties she faced and what she accomplished despite her challenges.
Well, from the beginning, she would have had an education, but a limited education, as young women had at the time. You know, even the best education at the time would have left out the sciences, for example, would have left out probably mathematics. And it would have been very focused to preparing a young woman for, you know, to get married, to find a husband, or else to stay with her family and help her family. So I suppose that you know, she didn't learn Latin, for example, and that's probably something that she found to be something of a handicap. She mentions it, you know, I don't speak Latin, and it's something she had to kind of work against. From then, I mean, I suppose her role within the family then as a daughter, you know, she was in Dublin for a time and probably beginning to form, you know, an independent life of some sort, and she probably was beginning to formulate plans of what her life could be. And she was unceremoniously sent back to West Cork to nurse her mother and her brother. And from then on, her, you know, the main point of her life, and she said that herself in her letters, whatever she felt in her heart, what she said was her main role in life was to help and care for her family. So that in itself, you know, was something to work against. She suffered ill health all her life, probably from when she was, you know, the early days in school. Again, it was very common at the time for young women in that type of schooling to suffer from ill health, just from bad diet, you know, cold, deprivation of one sort or another. So, you know, we don't know exactly what her illness was, but some form of TB, and then complications from the treatment for TB, and, you know, various side illnesses. I have my own theories as well about her mental state, what it would have been like for a very intelligent woman of that time to have to operate within those kind of restrictions. I don't think would be good for anyone's mental health. And I do think she struggled with, I can see signs of maybe Laura as a psychologist would come in, you know, intense anxiety, depression, you know. And I do think her botany was a way for her to manage and cope with, you know, those. I mean, she herself wouldn't have probably, you know, thought about her mental state in those terms. But it's quite obvious in her letters as she gets more and more comfortable talking to Dawson Turner. I know we'll talk about the letters in a while. What starts out as a very, you know, a formal discussion about botany, she opens up to him and she starts to reveal her inner self. But her accomplishments, you know, were truly astonishing. I mean, so astonishing that they're actually difficult to process in modern terms, because we have so many distractions to deal with. And she focused, you know, very wholeheartedly on her botany. But that's not to say she also had a lot of work on the family estate. I think she took on a lot to help her brother Jack, who increasingly over the years had poor health, and nursing her mother. So really, I mean, she got up very early in the morning and she stayed up very late, and she was diligent. And of course it was seasonal. During the long winters, she did very little. And then in the summer, there was this huge burst of activity. And you could detect in the letters how her spirits rise once the spring comes. And she always has these plans for the summer, you know, living for the summer. So she, I mean, you know, it's important also to say that because of her class, Ellen did have advantages that many, you know, the vast majority of Irish people could only dream of. You know, she would have had regular food. She had a roof over her head. She needn't worry about being left homeless and, you know, so on. But having said that, if we take her as a woman of her class and we don't, you know, start comparing her, you know, to other Irish people, I think it was a hard life. I think it was not an easy life. And I think her accomplishments, recording over 1,000 species of plants, hundreds and hundreds of absolutely exquisite drawings, supplying rare plants to botanists all across Europe. I mean, just absolutely astonishing.
Totally astonishing. Laura.
Well, I agree with everything that Marianne said. The scope of her achievements was just incredible. I think it just showed how, I mean, it's incredible to believe she accomplished so much against a background of such hardship. I know we're saying that she was from a particular class, but she was very much from a poorer end of that class. And I think the limitations were everywhere. They weren't just social. I mean, she had a very narrow social life, which has already come out in the extract that Marianne read there. Very limited social contacts. So there were financial restraints as well. Everything she did or sent, every letter, there was all sorts of mechanisms to receive these letters with minimal payment, because everything cost money, receiving letters, receiving samples. So there's wonderful examples within the letters of how some of her correspondents would send them via another person who was going back to Ireland, who would go to Dublin, who might be come to Cork. So she was battling against all of that, against even getting books, for example, to further pursue. And then I also think too that while the landscape was a great inspiration for her and provided her with all of these wonderful examples of plants and seaweeds and so forth, it wasn't an easy landscape either to live within. It wasn't an easy landscape to traverse, and it required a lot of planning. She referred to getting up at 3 a.m. in the morning to go up and see a lake where she knew she'd find something interesting. So nothing was easy. Transport wasn't easy. And yet, you know, she persisted and pursued it to such a remarkable extent. She really was an incredible woman.
And when I participated in the very first Ellen Hutchins festival, we trekked up to the top of Knockboy. Now, we were all able to drive up to Priestleaf and then walk from there. She went up there, goodness knows how, in her skirts and her stout boots, and discovered at the top a dwarf willow, the smallest tree ever discovered. Amazing, amazing stuff. So given, Laura, that your psychiatrist background, what drove her?
I think I've wondered about that quite a lot. I mean, as Marianne said, she was obviously a very intelligent woman, and she was living in an extremely confined area of the country. I mean, as I said, she didn't have social visits. She was looking after a very sick mother, but she was given this interest and this gift she had obviously an incredible gift of attention and observation. And I just feel this was it for her. You know, this was something she could do within the limitations of her life, you know, and she certainly went for it. And I do think, you know, she had that scientist's eye and she had that scientist's drive, and she pursued it. She was an incredible woman.
Marianne, do you think there was something else that drove her?
Yes, I mean, I like Laura, I spent a long time thinking about her motivation, and actually, it's one of the many things that inspired me to write the book was the question of what inspires somebody like that to that kind of achievement. And I think it's a multi-layered thing. I think on a very simple level, she wanted, you know, like we all do, you know, we want to be acknowledged as being here and having achieved something, and that our lives have some kind of value. I think this was massively important to her. I think she wanted to be loved. I think she wanted her intelligence to be acknowledged. And I think she very quickly and astutely latched on to the idea that this was the perfect way to do this in all kinds of ways. And I think the correspondence with Dawson Turner was just, you know, just a gift from heaven to her, that this intelligent, worldly man, very renowned in his field, based in England, which would have been the center of, you know, of the world in terms of, you know, botany as far as she was concerned, the Linnaean Society, so on, you know. I think it was amazing for her that she had this contact with him. And I think, you know, apart from the fact that he was, you know, this confidant, and as I said, as the letters go on, she opens up to him more and more because he's a very sympathetic figure. He's very warm. You can see as the letters go on, there's all kinds of subtleties. He's deducing that there's a need in her to talk. He's teasing her out. He's allowing her to share things. But apart from that, I do think the number one thing was that he was acknowledging her gift, and this was massively important to her. So yeah, I think she wanted her life to have meaning, and I think now the festival, the fact that people are talking about. I think it's probably, you know, all of that would, I'm sure, be delightful to her. But I think the main thing would be still that botanists today talk about her, that she's remembered by botanists. You know, that's the important thing.
Yeah. And I suppose fairly universal. We all want that, don't we?
Yeah.
Now, Marianne, although it's based very closely on what knowledge exists about Ellen's life and work, we're very conscious that your book is a work of literary fiction, not a biography. And you had to imagine so much, and you had to make a lot of artistic choices about the personalities of the actors in your drama. Now, did Ellen's character emerge for you from her own writings and your research, or was it more of a creative exercise for you of assessing what traits and characteristics you were going to endow her with?
I think it's both, and I think it was very much an evolving thing. I think at the beginning, I imagined her as quite a passive character, you know, because you know, it's tricky writing about young women, particularly at that time, because they were encouraged to be modest and they were encouraged to be passive. That was the ideal, you know, young female. So at the beginning, she is passive. She's modest. She's quiet. She doesn't shout. She doesn't ask for what she wants. But really, as the book evolved, her personality evolved. And I mean, and the letters were a key thing for me. And the tone of voice is there in the letters, which is very important. It's great to have a cue for tone of voice. It's very difficult to establish that. But then, having said that, I do think I reached a point where I had to make some kind of leap in terms of, I need to bring something extra to this, you know, for it to be literary fiction. And I need to really dig deep and imagine, you know, a young woman of the time, what her thoughts and feelings might be. So say even beyond botany and beyond, you know, she would have had, you know, sexual feelings. She would have experienced desire. She would have experienced frustration, love, all of these things. And I suppose, you know, so I had to reach back in time to when I was a young woman that age, and some of the things that I felt, and try and connect with her in that way.
Right, and Laura, it's obvious to me in the poems that I've seen from you that you also imagine a character for Ellen, and plus you're about to publish a novel yourself about an historical character most of us have never heard of. And can you relate to what Marianne is saying about that both that mixture of the research and the creative assessment of what a character would be?
Absolutely. I mean, the character I was researching for my book, as you say, somebody very much from the sidelines. There's very little left apart from little hints in letters and correspondence. He's Tony Small is his name, and he was the manservant of Lord Edward Fitzgerald. So he's really mentioned in the side of other people's letters, and there were very little facts about him. And similarly with other characters related. But I find that sometimes it's just those little facts that give you some insight. It could be a tiny word, a description of some little trait. You know, he was careful with money. Just tiny little things. I think that's where you find the character. And the rest are gaps. And the gaps are where the imagination comes in and where the creative leap, it's where the possibilities are actually. The gaps are good. The facts are good, but the gaps are good too.
Yes, it gives you great scope. Now, it's all about botany, right? So Ellen is all about botany, and it's the center of the novel and very much the center of the poems too. So I'll ask both of you, would you consider yourself a botanist, or if not, what word would you use? And how have you developed or arrived at a person who has an interest in plants? Let's start with Marianne.
Well, I mean, I'm very passionate about nature, but you know, with this, you know, nature with a small n, you know, so it's nature in the fields, in the hedgerows, and I learned that as a small child. My father taught all of us to, you know, look in hedgerows, look for the magic. You know, we'd be looking for fairies, and then through that we'd see the plants, and they lived in the plants and so on. And then in school we had that, you know, the table where we brought in with the seasons. So it would be conkers in the autumn and cowslips in the spring. And that's something that made a huge, the bordula, I think it's called, if somebody can correct me if I'm wrong there, that made a huge impact on my imagination, this idea of seasons, and this idea that, you know, we lived through seasons, and that there was always, as things died, there was other things to look forward to, and there would be renewal. So yeah, I mean, I you know, very interested in nature, very interested in ecology, but, you know, in a sort of a small sense, as in, I do think if we could learn more to look at small things close to the ground, they're nearer to us. I think that's the key to the big questions about things like climate change, for example. It's very hard to take that sort of stuff to really have an understanding of it if you're disregarding everything that's around you. So, you know, like Ellen, I was able to connect with that that aspect of Ellen, that ability she had to look down all the time and not miss things and really, really see things. She was short-sighted, where she could see things very well up close, but not far away. And I think that was actually a very important thing in her career as a botanist. I think, you know, maybe everything in the distance was kind of fuzzy, but she realized that she was, you know, she had a very good eye for things that were close. So yeah, so I do love nature, but I'm not a botanist in any sense. Any Latin name sends me into complete panic. I just cannot retain Latin names at all. And I was very intimidated by the botany aspect of the book. And I had to find a way to manage that, and a way to make decisions about how I was going to depict the botany in a way that was both credible and that was enjoyable for the reader and would not be too heavy for the reader to digest.
And of course, botanists take themselves very seriously.
Yes.
And only use the Latin names. I had an experience recently where I was writing about guerrilla botany, where you chalk in the names of the weeds, you know, as
yes,
and I posted it on one of the forums, and guess what the most frequent comment was? The names should have been in Latin. Laura, do you refer to yourself as a botanist?
Absolutely not. No. I think, I don't know, wildflower spotter might be, I don't know if there's such a word for it, but it's something I've been interested in, as I discovered recently when I went back to look at an old wildflower book that I have. And I used to write in where, you know, against it, the date and where I saw each particular flower. And it's really since I started coming to the Beara Peninsula, a place I've been coming to now, thanks to my husband, since, I suppose, the early 1990s. And that certainly coincides with the dates that are in the book that I've marked in. And it's just one of those things I started noticing. Plants, especially. There's a kind of a cliff walk, or at least it's just overlooking the sea, and all the plants were really low down. And I actually think it was the low down ones. I just hadn't noticed them, and then suddenly I did, and I had to know what they were. And I think it was eyebright actually, or something that I first came across. And since then it just persisted, and I cannot walk without looking. And then you begin to want to see ones that you know are in your book but you haven't seen, and you know they come out at a certain time of year, and so you know, I find I'm on the lookout for things, and it's got it to a very competitive point because other members of my family, my sisters, have become incredibly interested too in recent years, and yeah, it has become a family thing.
And of course, as you both know, words have power and naming has power. And once you name something, it becomes more important, doesn't it? And
I love the different names too. The fact that there are different names for similar flowers and different names in different areas. And even the Irish translations of some of their names are different. You know, they don't hold the same meaning as the English. So there's lots of interests there.
Yes, for sure. Now, I love the idea of a literary pilgrimage. When writing the book or when writing the poems, did either of you go on a literary pilgrimage or feel the need to go on one? And if so, what did it do for you in terms of this novel and the poems? Now, of course, if you didn't go on one, we'll move on.
Will I start? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, yes, I did. So I made several trips to Bantry, and we took several of the walks that Ellen would have taken, and they're marked now. You know, they're not. You know, there is a very good Ellen's, you know, walking trails that you can take, and I recommend them highly. And what did I get from it? Well, two things. I think there's a very unique atmosphere in that part of Cork. It's not the most dramatic of landscapes in terms of extremely big cliffs and there's something almost modest itself about the landscape, and there's almost, you know, there's a sense of mystery, there's a sense of things hidden, and again, just that sense of walking in Ellen's footsteps was very, very important. And then, of course, having to go back in my mind and realize that the landscape would have changed again. Like, we're talking nearly 200 years ago, and while a lot is still the same, a lot is different. But being able to pick out the things that are the same, you know, the actual coastline, those little rivulets of water that run down, the shingle beach, the actual walks, being able to pick out some of the flowers. Very, very important, extremely important. I knew I'd been to West Cork once before I started researching the book, but it was more to the Sheep's Head Peninsula. So that was my first time in that part of the world. And even Bantry itself, to get a sense of Bantry as a place, and this feeling of it being at the other end of the world. That you can only know that when you're there and feel that. And of course that permeates then the whole book. So yeah, very important.
Laura?
I have to say, no, I haven't done a literary pilgrimage in that sense of the word, but it's a place I'm very familiar with. I go there, you know, I'm there several times a month down in that neighbourhood, making the drive down from the Coosan Pass down to Quailkill and then hitting Ballylickey, and it never fails to excite coming up on the water there at Ballylickey, and then on out via Glengariff and passing those rivers. And of course, since I've heard and read about Ellen Hutchins, she's kind of always there when I go through those areas, and think of her down there on the beaches and clambering over rocks, or the other things that, you know, the waterfall that she says is dear to me. She's some beautiful ways of putting things. So yes, she's often in my mind, and she was in my mind in Glengariff, where I went recently to the nature reserve. And a lot of the woodland there is old woodland, whereas much of it, of course, has been chopped down many, many years ago. So there is a sense that it was somewhere like this that Ellen would have been. And the other aspect, I think, that I suppose maybe visiting at different times brings is the kind of temporal aspect to the landscape, and what Ellen might have seen at different times. And that, not just in terms of botany, but in terms of the mountainsides, you know, when you come around a corner and there's sunlight hits things differently at different times of year. And it even hits that grass. I think that's on those hillsides. Is it Fionn? Or, you know, at different times of years it's green, but sometimes it's got that golden, you know, fabulous quality. So I think, you know, yes, time of year kind of makes a difference, and it's lovely to be able to see it during the seasons, as Marianne described.
I often think the light in the winter is particularly wonderful. I just want to remind participants that if they have questions, they can type them into the Q&A box. Marianne, what did you edit out of this book and why?
Edit out of her life, or edit out of?
Edit out of the book. Once you'd written your first draft, or maybe your second or third, what did you edit out?
What did I edit out? Well, to be honest, I wrote it to a very tight plan and to a very tight timeline. So it wasn't like I had to go and start, you know, cutting out big chunks of. So there would just be certain aspects. For example, there was a lot of children. People had a lot of children, not Ellen, but everyone Ellen knew. So the Turners had a lot of children. The Stokeses had a lot of children. So depending, you know, sometimes just, you know, another birth was just way too much information for people to cope with. So things like that went. various, I mean, even some of these, say, botanizing trips that I would have put in, it was just, you know, too much of the same thing. So you just have to keep those quite tight. But to be fair, yeah, I mean, I wrote, so the advantage of the letters and the advantage of writing a book about a real person is that you have at least a timeline. Well, I did in Ellen's case anyway. So in some ways, you know, there's some ways you could say there's not a lot of information about Ellen, but in fact, you know, in some ways there's quite a lot of information about Ellen. And through the letters, we do have a timeline on a lot of things. So I was able to write quite a tight timeline and stick to it. But I wouldn't say there was no character that was put in and then suddenly ditched at the last minute. In fact, it was the opposite. Some of these supporting characters, we can call them that. So I'm just thinking, for example, of Arthur, Ellen's older brother, and Caroline, for example, Ellen's friend. So Arthur is a real character. She did have a brother called Arthur, but there was no Caroline that we know of. That was a completely invented character. And actually, when working with the editor, Susan McKeever, on the book, she noticed that those characters, she said, you know, you introduced them and they were interesting, and then they sort of disappeared. So actually, instead of taking stuff out, I did quite a bit of adding in. So Arthur became a much more developed character. And actually, I'm very fond of Arthur now, I have to say. And I'm terribly fond of Caroline. She's one of my favorite characters in the book. And interestingly, for most of the book, she just exists in letters. She writes their school friends, and she ends up writing to Ellen. So that was a very interesting exercise in character development, and yeah, how to keep the flow of characters going through a book. Yeah, but just, you know, tidying up little things, you know, that's not needed. That's taking away. Yeah.
So a huge part of the novel is the historical research, and this was challenging research, wasn't it? And tell us about, you know, what was easy about that research and what turned out to be quite difficult.
Well, there are things that I'm naturally very interested in, and that stuff was easy. So, you know, I'm very interested in Georgian architecture, for example. So all of that, reading about the houses and the buildings and so on, I found that very easy. I would read a lot about that just for enjoyment anyway. I mean, things that were difficult, there were things that were challenging just because there's such gaps in information. So for example, clothing at the time, like women of her class at the time, as Laura said, even though she was of, you know, the landlord class and in theory, you know, very privileged position, they were at the poorer end. So that sort of poorer gentry, there's not very many paintings, for example, of that class. They weren't out buying lots of clothes. They weren't out buying lots of jewelry. They lived quite modestly. And it was actually very difficult to find references for clothing for somebody of Ellen's class. And I really had to use a lot of imagination and a lot of, okay, well, what would I do in this situation? You know, I have to go out on a boat and I'm going to get soaked and there's no such thing as Gore-Tex. Well, what do I do? Well, maybe I get some sailcloth and I get a cloak made and I cover it in some kind of fat. And so those kind of things were actually difficult and took a lot of thinking about. Little small details, you know, the journeys she took. So the journey from Cork to Dublin, it wasn't that it was difficult. The information is there. There are these beautiful almanacs. You know, the National Library has them all, for example. So does UCC. So of the time, I mean, these incredibly useful almanacs, which had everything from every doctor in the country was named to, including Whitley Stokes. So I was able to find the name of his original rooms on French Street, to the road network. And, you know, and the amazing thing was, it was more sophisticated than you might think. You know, the bones of it were pretty much there. So all of that, you know, if she was going from Cork to Dublin, she'd have to go to Cork first. She'd have to stay the night in Cork because the journey from Bantry to Cork took so long. Then to document the journey. So to get those things right was, you know, took a little bit of attention. But I would say the research, as I said, in terms of the main challenge was the gap in terms of, because of Ellen's specific class and specific economic situation, they are not very well documented at the time. So that was a little bit challenging, yeah. And then, I mean, you're of course, you're very conscious about getting things wrong. And I'm sure there are little things in it that are still wrong. I will just gloss over those, but you do your best, you know. And then obviously the botany side of it was the most challenging. The most challenging research was definitely the botany.
So, Laura, in an email to me, you said that your poems were written in response to, which is always an interesting, I think, exercise to respond to something. You said they were written in response to reading the Ellen Hutchins Dawson Turner correspondence, and also to the landscape and natural world. Now, some of your poems even take off from words and phrases in the letters exchanged between Ellen and Dawson Turner. And first of all, briefly, for those who don't know, can you tell us a little bit, because we've talked about him and he's so important in Ellen's life, tell us a little bit about who he was and the role or roles that he played in Ellen's life.
Well, Dawson, I think, was probably about 10 years older than Ellen Hutchins. He was from a prosperous family in England. I think he was from Yarmouth, and he was somebody who had a very good education, unlike Ellen. He attended Cambridge, I think, some college in Cambridge, but he didn't finish because at the age of 21, his father was seriously ill and subsequently died. And so Dawson had to take over the family bank, which they owned, which is where their money obviously came from. But he'd had some experience of botany at school, and when he took up the bank work in his spare time, he then really seemed to actively pursue botany. And he had a really good circle of similarly minded men who were constantly going off in search of things, including, as he mentioned, I think, one who went off 300 or 400 miles in search of a beetle. So he had already got this set of really interesting kind of people who were passionate about their pursuit. At the stage then that he was put in touch with Ellen, I think that was around 1807 or something, and he was put in fact, I think, in touch by the botanist that Marianne already mentioned, Mackay. Is it Mackay? In her extract that she read. So they started a correspondence, and it went on for years, I think 7 years, and it grew increasingly intimate. And when I say intimate, I just mean to the degree in which they revealed themselves to each other. It started with just sharing botanical specimens. Dawson was very good to her. He sent over many specimens and books. He recommended general literature to her. And in turn, then, she sent him back her drawings and her specimens too, many of which were then used, the drawings and the specimens, in subsequent publications with Dawson Turner's encouragement. So he was really encouraging. She was of her. He was a confidant in her later years. And he named one of his children after her, and she was godmother to one of his children. And she took a great interest in that little child as well. I think it was a real compliment to her. He was an interesting man, actually, and he was very sympathetic. He had a great sense of humor that comes across the letters. He was constantly excusing himself for not having written such a short letter, and he had endless reasons of why, like, he procrastinated so much. And there were lovely literary references back and forth between the two to what they were reading at the time. So the actual correspondence, I think, is fascinating. And he seemed to really encourage her, almost drive her on, to the extent of her finding those 1,000 specimens from her local neighborhood, a list of 1,000 specimens. And that was with his kind of encouragement. It didn't take much, and she was off. So I think a very sympathetic understanding between them. So at that level of intimacy, there was real concern and care between the two of them.
Despite the fact, or maybe because of the fact, that they never actually met.
They never met, and he extended invitations, and she extended invitations, and when she was unwell, he encouraged her to come over and be looked after by his wife, but I'm not sure how that would have worked out. But yes, maybe, I don't know whether in spite of, but they retained a really warm friendship, which is lovely to read. Actually, their letters are really to make terrific reading, I think.
And as I said, you've taken sort of trigger phrases from those letters and used it. And I'd love you to read the poem that you sent me called Moss, because to me, that sort of encapsulates so much of what Ellen was looking at and trying to look at. Can you do that?
I will do. There it is. So this poem, as you said, is called Moss, and it was inspired, well, by two things, I suppose. I'm interested in moss, or well, I'm interested in plants anyway, at that kind of level, not at Ellen's level, but it was a line in one of the letters that she wrote to Dawson Turner. She was quite sick at this point, and she had difficulty reading. She couldn't seem to tolerate much. She was just so weak at that stage. So she knew she wouldn't be able to read. She'd even difficulty writing, but she asked him to, this was in 1814, she asked him to send me a moss, anything just to look at. She sees beyond the limits of her eyes, her intimate gaze more penetrating than her borrowed microscope. She looks, stays looking, absorbed in seeing a forest of green rosettes, red stems, and lowermost, the decomposing parts holding up the rest. She knows the music of moss, the notes of pressure and release, listens to the soak of it, the spring of tiny leaves, the gap before a breathy sigh. She has almost heard its little caps explode, a pop of smoky spores. Her hands sense history in its depths, memory layered in darkness. Long years since the woman of Drumcera last plaited her hair, laid or was lain in a bog like this, her daily efforts forgotten, her remains plucked apart and wondered over briefly, her life like moss, a sacrifice for the next.
Oh, wonderful. And for an ex-archaeologist like myself, I loved the reference to the bog body, the woman of Hera. And I often use poems in my blog. I'll do a whole blog and a poem and illustrate it with my own photographs. And I'm always looking for great quotes because, you know, everything is in the title, right? So I found about 4 different wonderful quotes in that poem that I could use as a title. She sees beyond the limits of her eyes. And that's such a great reference, not just to the microscope, but to her knowledge. Her knowledge. She looks at a moss. She sees what we don't, for sure.
Yeah.
Now, just remind the participants once again that they can type in their questions into the question and answer facility. Marianne, this is a very interesting period in Irish history, and particularly in West Cork, where the French sailed up into Bantry Bay in 1796, creating an ongoing fear of invasion. Emmanuel, the oldest brother, was a member of the United Irishmen. He was a friend of Wolfe Tone's, but not a lot is known about him. We know he qualified as a barrister. And though I think he may be, I haven't counted, but maybe he occupies fewer pages in the novel than the other brothers, but he looms very large as a defining actor in the drama. What sources did you find helpful in your quest to write him as a character in this novel? How did you imagine him? He's certainly not a sympathetic character. So how did you come up with this persona, the very strong persona that you give Emmanuel?
Well, as you say, we don't know a lot about Emmanuel. We do know he was a friend and acolyte of Wolfe Tone. He went to Trinity College. He was obviously educated to a very high degree. At the start of the book, he's living in London, working as a barrister. Madeline, you know, as a Hutchins family member, had some other, things she had deduced from the letters. You know, he seemed to have money troubles from time to time. worried about his health. There was always a sense of something slightly shady going on. You know, was he avoiding people, or was he? I mean, my own starting point. I like to present characters. I know people have said to me, "Oh, how could Emmanuel have done the things he did in the book?" And I suppose if there's a baddie, he is a baddie in the book. But I like to present my characters in shades of grey, not black and white. And even with Emmanuel, I have tried to give some sense of where he was coming from. And I suppose my starting point was that relationship with Wolfe Tone. And I imagine that after what happened to Wolfe Tone, that Emmanuel was probably hugely traumatized and hugely damaged, and probably extremely frightened for his own safety and for his own position, because he was on the losing side, basically. I mean, Stokes himself, Whitley Stokes himself, who is, you know, was an extremely revered character in Dublin society and so on, but he skated very close to the edge himself and almost lost his position in Trinity because he was on the losing side. And because he was such an eminent figure, he managed to work his way back into society. But Emmanuel was younger and was probably slightly, you know, less stable than Whitley Stokes. So yes, yeah, so I came at it that he was a damaged person. I mean, there's also, there was tragedy in the family. Ellen's oldest sister, Catherine, died when Ellen was, I think, 5. Madeline will correct me. And again, that must have been a very dark period. And Emmanuel would have been a young man, and he was, you know, his sister had died. Ellen's father died when she was 2 years of age, and Emmanuel was left as the head of the family as a very young man. And again, that is something that is very formative, but it can go either way. You know, it can make somebody, or it can, again, be extremely traumatic. And that's a huge burden for somebody to take on. And then the estate was very complicated. There was, you know, there was wills, there was land, there was, you know, this, that, and the other. And I think perhaps he was, again, I mean, no more than Ellen, perhaps he was in a place in his life that he didn't particularly want to be. Maybe he didn't want that responsibility. Maybe he wanted more freedom. And he you know, in the book, I do present him as somebody who is, you know, quite bitter, quite thwarted. Unfortunately, he takes that out on other people. And I mean, the relationship with Ellen and himself would not have been unusual for an older brother at the time. I mean, maybe you could hope for a kinder or more benign older brother. But the fact remained that you were in, if you did not have money of your own and your father was dead, you were in the control of your eldest relative, your eldest brother. And, you know, he would decide what happened to you. So, yes, he causes Ellen a lot of anxiety and stress. I mean, we do know we don't know 100% that he's referencing Emmanuel, but I made the leap that he was. So Thomas Taylor, Ellen's great friend and a very important character in the book, he writes to Dawson Turner after her death, and, you know, he says that her brothers, you know, destroyed her. It was her oldest brother who, you know, was responsible, and so on. So, you know, there were, as Laura said earlier, with a character like Emmanuel, who is a bit in the shadows, you know, you pick up little threads here and there. And I think there was, Madeline found a letter, an unpublished letter later on, which did mean, you know, Ellen does say something like, you know, you've tried to get rid of me and this type of thing. So I suppose I was extrapolating quite a lot, but at the same time, I feel that I was not totally unfair to Emmanuel. And he's certainly a very interesting character. He had a very interesting death. In his later years, he was out in Damascus spying horses for Lord Kenmare, and he died quite mysteriously. You know, what he was doing there and what, you know, so a very interesting character. You know, and the Hutchinses had a history of, there was some smuggling, there was some, you know, but then he spoke up for some men who were in danger of being hanged after the rebellion. He did speak up for them. So, you know, yes, hopefully not a black and white character, hopefully shades of grey, but, you know, quite dark grey, I suppose.
And certainly very, very influential in Ellen's life. Now, I want to make sure that I leave time for more readings and also for the questions that participants might have. But for the moment, I'm going to hand it over now to Madeline, because Madeline, you have some artifacts to share with us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about them and show us what they are?
Sure, thank you. Yes, I've got a few things I'm just going to hold up to show. The first one here is a photograph from 1910 of Ballylickey House, the house that was the Hutchinses, that we were tenants, actually, the family of Lord Kenmare. But this is where Ellen lived, and it probably changed very little, actually, in the 100 years from when she was there to when this photo was taken by another later generation, MPhil Hutchins. And then I've got a couple of her drawings. I can get these to show. These are ones that are in a publication at Kew in the archives there. And this is actually one of her very early ones of a seaweed. A huge amount of detail. It's quite beautiful, but it also is doing what a botanical drawing needs to do. There's a plant portrait showing all of the detail. And a couple of other, I particularly like this one, I must say. And as you say, there are absolutely hundreds of these that she did. And in some of the letters, you can see the speed she's working at. She's saying, you know, I've done 5 since your last letter. And a third, which again, I think where this one's really quite interesting is the technical detail that it's showing. Of the way that the plant releases its little spores, or whatever they're called. Fructification, she calls it. And then I've got some of her letters. We found 46 letters that she wrote to, nearly all to her younger brother, Sam, which is the one all the Hutchinses we know around are descended from. And the piece of paper starts something this size. It's a bit longer than A4. You'd have folded it, and then that would give you 3 sides to write on. This one and the 2 in the middle. And then there were no envelopes. You folded it, a bit like origami, and you tuck it in, and then you seal it with the wax. I've got some that we've kept folded. There's one here in the folded form. This is being sent to her brother Sam in Dublin. He's at Trinity College. The boys got to go to university, the girls didn't. You might be able to see a big 7 that is on. It costs 7p to send a single page letter. And it says Bantry 164 because it's 164 miles from Bantry to Dublin. And you paid by the distance as well as the amount, how many sheets in it. Similarly, this is another one going to Sam, same address, Northumberland Street in Dublin. And this one's 1 shilling and 2pence. Can you see the 1 and 2? And that's 14p. So this one either would have had 2 sheets in it, it was a longer letter, or as one of them, in fact the one I had opened says, she's including £3 in that one, enclosing £3, and asking him to buy a book called Fox's History. She also rather sweetly says in it that it's the honey season has commenced, and you shall have some for your breakfasts. So they were going to send it up to Dublin, so he had some of the home honey to put on his toast at breakfast, which I think is rather nice. And as well as it costing more to send a second sheet of paper, twice the price, paper could become quite scarce, and it wasn't very easy to just pop from Ballylickey to Bantry to get yourself another sheet. Certainly, as Ellen often did, she'd be writing at 1 in the morning. She says she's the only one awake in the house apart from the mice. And so what she did was cross-hatch if she was running out of paper. This is only a half sheet, so she has a serious paper problem. And what she's done is she's written in the normal fashion. In fact, I've probably got this upside down. No, I think it's the right way up. She's written across, as you'd expect. Then she's turned the sheet sideways and written the other way. So it's called cross-hatching, and it is incredibly difficult to read. I have read this one. There's a lot of rather gruesome details about toothache and the treatment of it in that one. But just to show you some of that, there's there one other. Oh yeah, just to show you the back of one of the envelopes. That's the seal on the back. It says TH, probably her father's seal that she's using there. And this one's collected lots of stamps. This was going to the eldest brother, Emmanuel, in London. And it's collected English stamps as well as it's got an Irish one there. And that's what stamps used to be. They used to be the things that the post office stamped on it. There were no stamps as we know them and you just they write on it what the person receiving it is going to pay. 7p there, and there's 1 and 8 there, which is the cost of getting it from Dublin to London. But just to give you a sense of that's what the letters look like, and so did the ones to Dawson Turner that are held in the Wren Library in Cambridge.
Thank you, thank you. That really added to our appreciation of all those letters and what was involved in writing them and in sending them. Now, a couple of questions. First one for Marianne. Marianne, this is from one of the participants. It says, the leap you speak of in writing her character, it almost seems like your leap mirrors Ellen's in taking on her work. Is that too much to suggest?
No, I'm sure I was reflecting back what I was reading, you know, what I was learning about Ellen. I was reflecting back Ellen's journey. So as I went, you know, further into, you know, thinking about her character, I think I probably was, you know, did become conscious of being on some sort of evolving, deepening process. And yeah, I think the two did echo each other in the end. Yeah, I mean, the leap was partly my leap as a writer to try and, as I said earlier, to dig deeper and beyond, you know, below the surface. Excuse me. Yeah, so just to dig below the surface and see what I could bring, and echoing, as I said, Ellen's struggle, Ellen's own, you know, lifelong, you know, trials and her searching. I mean, she spent her whole life searching. That's what she did. You know, she searched, and at the end, I mean, at the end of my book, I like to suggest that, you know, she in some ways, you know, found what she was looking for with her life's work. But yeah, I do think the two dovetailed together, certainly.
And talking about your work, would you have another section for us to read, please? Set the scene for us and tell us what you're going to read.
This involves 3 characters that we haven't had time yet to speak about. So in the summer of 1809, Sam was home from college that summer. It turned out to be sort of a golden summer, and Ellen took a lot of time off from collecting plants just to enjoy herself because her younger brother was home, and she enjoyed his company hugely. But in the middle of all this, 3 botanists arrived from, well, 2 botanists and 1 entomologist arrived from the famous Mr. Leach, who travelled the 400 miles in search of a beetle. So these 2 botanists and entomologists arrive in Ballylickey because they have, well, Ellen has been sending plants to one of them, and they're very curious about her and they want to meet her. You know, she's already a bit of a legend. So they basically send a letter announcing their arrival at Ballylickey for their breakfast. So Mr. Dillwyn is Mr. Dillwyn, Mr. Woods and Mr. Leach are the three characters. Mr. Dillwyn proclaimed the breakfast at Ballylickey the finest he'd had since landing in Ireland. The food has otherwise been abominable, he said, mopping at his forehead with a large handkerchief. Are you too warm, Mr. Dillwyn? Thank you, Mrs. Hutchins, I'm quite comfortable. Your dining room is delightfully cool. His coat was cut from a dark red, suede-like fabric and accentuated his high colour. Dark curling hair circled a bald spot on his crown. The detritus of breakfast, crockery, crusts, crumbs, lay scattered across the tablecloth. Sam had gone to Bantry early on horseback and met the Englishmen there. He'd accompanied their hired carriage back to Ballylickey, where they consumed a large dish of scrambled eggs, bread, potato cake, a full slab of butter, and half a jar of gooseberry preserve. We've had 1 or 2 decent meals, Mr. Woods said, though the claret is often thinner than I would prefer. He pulled on his nose and shook his head. Of a similar age to Mr. Dillwyn, somewhere around the mid-30s, his large body curled into itself as though to diminish its looming presence. What say you, Mr. Leach, said Jack from the head of the table. How do you like the food in Ireland? Oh, Mr. Leach is not a gourmand, Mr. Dillwyn said. He'd scarcely notice if he ate offal or fillet. Said affectionately, Mr. Leach smiled. I think the food perfectly adequate. His smooth face looked young enough to belong to a man still in the teens. He was thin and pale with a distracted air. His light brown hair flopped over his forehead. Each time he spoke, he brushed it back and held it off his forehead as if to give air to his thoughts. "Are you all botanists like my daughter?" asked Leonora. "I collect plants, mother," Ellen said. "I am no botanist." "Too modest, Miss Hutchins," Mr. Wood said. "By any methods used to define a botanist, we can say that Miss Hutchins is one," said Mr. Dillwyn. "In answer to your question, madam," he bowed towards Leonora, "Mr. Woods and myself are avid botanists, but young Leach inclines more towards entomology. Would you believe a man could journey 400 miles to find a particular beetle?" Everyone laughed. "It's true," Mr. Leach said, nodding around the table. "And did you find it?" asked Leonora, blue eyes wide. "I did, madam, Citaris muralis, on a buttercup leaf in the New Forest." "And what did you do with it then?" "I brought it home in a tin box and added it in my collection." "Alive?" She sounded incredulous. "Alas, madam, it was necessary to then kill it, before mounting it with a pin to the elytra." "How horrible," she said. "Indeed," he said, "but I did a nice drawing of it afterwards." "Well, I call it a strange pastime." "I'm utterly consumed by it," he said. "My medical studies seem dull in comparison." "And what is your profession, Mr. Woods?" asked Sam. "Architecture, sir." "An exciting field," Sam said. "Though similar to my young friend, my true interest lays elsewhere, hence this trip." "Botany certainly seems to exert a peculiar fascination," Sam said. "You don't share your sister's passion for plants?" Mr. Leach asked. "One botanist in the family is enough. Besides, I would never have the patience." "You may in time, when youthful impetuosity passes away, giving rise to more reflective pursuits." "Perhaps you'll develop an interest in trees, like Arthur," Leonora said. "Have you chosen a profession, sir?" Mr. Dillwyn said. "Not as yet," Sam said. "At present, I'm in Trinity College, Dublin." Mr. Dillwyn bounced his fist lightly on the table. "Every man needs an occupation. Not only that, a man should fill his spare time as fully as he is able. Even a lady, once her familial responsibilities are met, can make a useful contribution. And now," he pushed back his chair, "we must get on, or the morning will be entirely spent." "What are your plans, gentlemen?" Jack asked. When he'd emerged from his bedroom that morning, he'd shaved and put on a clean shirt and jacket. He even succumbed without protest to Ellen's straightening his cravat. "We intend exploring the local beaches," Mr. Dillwyn said, "in search of the fine sea plant specimens Miss Hutchins finds so regularly." "Perhaps we can visit some of the islands close by," said Mr. Woods. "Whiddy, at least," Ellen said. "May I offer you the use of our boat?" Jack said. "I have a man who would take you out at your convenience." Mr. Dillwyn bowed. "Most considerate of you, Mr. Hutchins. We'd be delighted." He drew back his chair. The other two men took the cue and with a last wipe of their mouths stood to go. "You'll come back for dinner," Jack said. "If your breakfast is anything to go by, sir, we'll not be kept away." "I'd enjoy a trip to Whiddy myself," Sam said. "The more the merrier," Mr. Dillwyn said. "Miss Hutchins, you'll join us, of course." Before she could speak, Sam said, "Alas, there's only room for 4 passengers." Again, Mr. Dillwyn's hands flew apart. "A pity. Still, Miss Hutchins, before we depart, we'll hold you to your promise to show us your herbarium. A fleeting look only, as we dawdled so long over breakfast." They proclaimed themselves astonished at the extent of her collections, crowding around her desk and talking all at once. It was midday before they made to leave. As they bustled out the door, Sam took her elbow. "You don't mind my going? I thought it hospitable to offer to accompany them." "You were correct," she said. "Someone should. And I'm not sure it would be seemly for you to go with them alone. Kind of you to consider my reputation." He looked crestfallen like a small boy. "I meant well, sister." She sighed. "I know it. Just go. They're waiting." He looked at her again, uncertain. The Englishmen could be heard outside, chattering loudly. His face cleared, he nodded and ran to join them.
Oh, what a poignant scene, and so expressive of the repressed regime that women lived under in those days. This genius and her younger brother got to go in her place.
Yes, very frustrating.
Another question here, question for Laura this time. would you speak of the importance of place for Ellen's work and in your own work, please?
Right, well, I'll start with place, I suppose, with Ellen then. I think it was key to her work. She was surrounded by mountains, and then she'd the sea, and then she'd the rivers. So for her, and the limits, it was all about boundaries. I mean, I mentioned that before, but the physical boundaries were very clear, although she did have the boat to get over to islands. So it is a place, I mean, for her and her work, that region is a place of great botanic interest, and there are plants there, for example, that aren't found in the rest of the country. There's very specific plants to the region, which must have been, you know, fantastic for her when she was able to send these specimens off. It must have caused great interest, you know, great interest in the fellow botanists. I think in terms of place, as there's I mean, there's different meanings for place in writing. And it's not just as backdrop. I think, for example, in Marianne's writing, she has conveyed a true sense of place to the extent that it made me look at it differently, actually. I was able to get that sense of place in time, which is quite, I think that's a very difficult thing to do. And I think she you know, I think it's by the particulars that you mentioned that you convey place in a particular way, and the kind of sensory descriptions that are given, which again, Marianne has kind of, it really makes the place different. It attends to the kind of particularities of the region. And that's something obviously in my own writing, I have thought about and think about how to convey that sense of place. As I said, in those sort of sensory details and in objects, you know, what might be seen at the time, because it's not just place, of course, it's time, it's place in time. Time is a significant element. Yeah, it's a very interesting thing, as is the landscape itself. And it's something I'm interested in, and how that has changed, and the names of places. And I think was it John Montague? He wrote a poem in which he said that the landscape is a manuscript that something to do we can no longer read. And I find that fascinating. So in the absence of being able to read it, we have to imagine it. And that's where the writing comes in.
Yes, I often think we stopped being able to read it in the Neolithic. All right, what about one last poem from you, Laura? You were sort of coming to the end of things, perhaps also to the end of Ellen's life. Very poignant at 29, tragic for any family. But when you think about the promise, that her life held, and the incredible achievements in such few years, it almost makes you weep, doesn't it? That what she battled and how short her life was. But anyway, Laura, what poem would you like to read us?
I'm going to read one which again was inspired by a line from the correspondence between Ellen and Dawson Turner. And this one was inspired by a letter where Dawson wrote to her when she was unwell, and he obviously knew she was unwell at that stage. And it is a very moving line, and it's something that just jumped out from those letters. He says to her, "Preserve yourself with care, I beseech you." So this poem is called Self-Preservation. How might she do it? Pressed between sheets of blotting paper, or pinned, wingless and silent, under glass? She could lie among apples in a straw-lined box, or with parsnips nestled in sawdust. She could hide from the cold under a cloche, nesting in a bed of freshest moss. So many ways. Cured in the smokehouse, laid out in the ice house, or soaked in a barrel of brine. Candied, jellied, pickled or potted, or fixed in a gobbet of fat. But no, not that. Not after all. She will seal herself like a precious seed in yellow beeswax. bring to him scent of honey, spiced pollen, and warm cedar, a final gift.
Oh, a final gift for Dawson. We've almost reached the end. A couple of more questions from our participants. Somebody wants to know, she says, I'm curious if Ellen Hutchins and Anna Atkins, a British botanist and photographer, had any contact with one another. Does that name ring a bell with either of you?
I think Annie Atkins was a slightly later period. Yeah.
All right. And lots of complimentary comments about both of you and how you have made Ellen real. Somebody says, you just did an incredible job of making it feel like I know Ellen. And I felt so sad when the book ended. And I want to echo that actually, because you know, when you have one of those movies where you know how it ends because, you know, it's like a docudrama or something, and yet still the writer manages to hold you in suspense. And I felt like that, and I was just dreading the ending because I knew what was coming. But Marianne, you chose to sort of have all that take place off stage, as it were. Do you think, why did you do that? And do you think, obviously that was a deliberate choice. Do you think you could have written it any differently?
Honestly, no. I mean, the ending, it came very instinctively. I didn't have to overthink it at all. Originally, there was no epilogue. Originally, that was something that was added at the editing process. And like I said, I wrote the epilogue very quickly. It came very like a dream, just in about 20 minutes. I just wrote it. I felt that the reader had invested so much in Ellen, if I had done my job properly, that I had to leave them with her still talking, still herself. And then I won't go too much into how it actually ends, but we do, you know, there's a moment where we come back to Ellen then. And I think that was probably for myself. You know, I was like my own reader. I had to leave her somewhat in the world still. And I also, yeah, I couldn't have a sort of long drawn out death scene. I just, after investing so much in the character. So no, honestly, I feel like it ended as naturally as it could have. And like I said, it's not something I had to think very much about at all. It just came very naturally. But I had to get Dawson in again at the end as well, because I was so fond of him. He was definitely, after Ellen, my favourite character in the book. I loved him, I loved his family, I loved Mary, I loved his children. So yeah, I mean, there are times where I have to pick up the book and I have to look back at the ending. And, you know, I'm not saying because of my writing or anything, I'm just saying because of the way things happened, where I still find myself moved. I still find myself tearful when I think about, and that beautiful line that Laura quoted, which I refer to quite obliquely towards the end, about, you know, bring me a moss, anything just to look at. I mean, how poignant. That was actually the last thing she ever wrote to Dawson Turner. I mean, you know, if she had sat down to create something more heartbreaking, she couldn't have, you know. Just that in her weakest final moments, her instinct was to touch something, to touch a moss. Just incredibly moving. I mean, her life had this beautiful arc. That's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. Just very beautiful from beginning to finish.
And you said earlier that she wanted to be loved, and I think you've accomplished that for her. She accomplishes that for herself, because everything you read about her, everything she writes about, you end up loving Ellen.
Yes.
I don't know anybody who could study her life, see her work, and not end up feeling what a wonderful person she was, and, you know, feeling sad about the fact that she didn't manage to, you know, live longer and give more. And however, as you say, a perfect arc. Yeah. Before I hand back to Madeline, I just have a quick note from Claire Herdman. She's pointing out that there's a competition write a poem or short piece of prose, 1,000 words max, inspired by Ellen's story or the nature on your doorstep, and be in with a chance to win a copy of A Quiet Tide by Marianne Lee, or botanist Ellen Hutchins, Botanist at Bantry Bay by Madeline Hutchins. And the details are on the website, ellenhutchins.com/festival-competition. So back to you now, Madeline. I think we've had a very rich, very wide-ranging discussion. We've focused on Ellen and very much also on the writing, which was the whole purpose of the seminar.
Great. Yes, indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all of you, Finola, Marianne and Laura, for giving us a very informative and interesting discussion, some lovely readings, insight into the writing processes and how and why Ellen acted as an inspiration. So a big thank you. The festival continues. It continues until Sunday in its virtual form. So do have a look on the website and see if there's anything else that, that takes your fancy there. We have one other webinar. It's next Saturday afternoon, and it's Carrie O'Flynn, the historical reenactor we've used for the last couple of years on letter writing issues. This time she's looking at costumes and customs of the early 1800s, Ellen's period. Carrie will be in costume herself when she's made, and she will be showing a video of putting on the various layers of clothing to build to what she is wearing. And she's, yeah, so that's Saturday afternoon, 2 till 3:30, and free, same as this one. And if I can end by another thank you to all of you for taking part today, those invisible and muted participants, as well as the three of our lovely speakers tonight. And I hope you've all enjoyed the time we've had together this evening. Goodbye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Yeah, bye from all of us. Thanks. Bye.